They brought her to me in chains, not because she had done anything wrong, not because she was a criminal, or a spy, or a threat to my court. They brought her in chains because my steward, Lord Edric, did not know what else to do with a woman who had walked 3 days through the Ashfire Pass, alone, on foot, in winter, and presented herself at the outer gate of Drakenhold with nothing but a healer's satchel over one shoulder and a calm expression on her face. She says she's here for the dragon, Edric told me, with the strained patience of a man who had seen too much to be surprised, and was surprised anyway. I told her the dragon doesn't receive healers. She said she'd wait. I looked at the woman standing in the center of my great hall. The chains on her wrists were absurd. She was not straining against them, not glancing at the exits, not doing anything a captive usually does. She was looking at the fire in the central hearth with the quiet attention of someone who had built 1,000 fires and was assessing whether this one was drawing correctly. She was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected. Someone desperate, perhaps. Someone wild-eyed with ambition or grief. The last 3 who had tried to approach Varric had been a decorated war captain from the southern territories, a court sorcerer who had spent 40 years studying dragonfire, and my own cousin, whose bond with fire beasts was considered the strongest in a generation. Varric had driven all 3 back before they crossed the outer courtyard. The war captain had broken 2 ribs. The sorcerer had lost his composure entirely and wept. My cousin had turned around before she even reached the gate, pale as snow, and said only, "He is not a dragon anymore. He is something wrong." That had been 6 months ago. Since then, Varric had not eaten. He lay in the mountain chamber at the heart of Drakenhold, a cavern of black stone and old heat, built for exactly this purpose. And he burned, not in the way of a healthy dragon, not the clean, controlled fire of a creature at rest. He burned the way a wound burns, low and constant and consuming. I could feel it when I pressed my hand to the stone of the inner walls. A sick heat, a dying heat. I was losing him, and I had run out of warriors, so I looked at this woman in my great hall, small in the way of someone who had never needed size to be formidable, with dark hair pinned back and a traveling cloak that had seen better years, and I said, "Take the chains off her." Edric stared at me. "She walked 3 days through the Ashfire Pass in winter," I said. "She is either the most capable person to have entered this hall in the last 6 months, or she is going to be driven back from the courtyard like the rest of them, and in either case, she doesn't need chains. Take them off." They took them off. She rubbed her wrists once, not dramatically, just the habitual gesture of someone restoring circulation, and looked up at me for the first time. Her eyes were the gray of a winter sky just before it breaks into something else. "You're the Dragon King," she said. Not a question. Not a title offered with deference or nerves. Just a statement, the way you'd name a thing before you dealt with it. "I am," I said. "And the dragon is Varric," she said. That stopped me. "His name isn't widely known." "No," she agreed. "I asked a shepherd outside Fenwick, who had grazed his flock in this valley for 30 years. He said the dragon used to fly at dawn, and that the old name for the pass was Varric's Crossing." She paused. "I assume they named it for him. They had. 300 years ago, when Varric was young, and the passes were dangerous, and he had cleared them, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had decided they should be clear. That was the nature of him. A vast, particular will, applied to whatever he chose. Applied now, to dying. You should know," I said, "that the last person who attempted to approach him was my own cousin, who carries firebond in her blood." She turned back at the gate. "I know," she said. She passed me on the road, going the other direction. A pause opened in the hall. Someone near the back, one of my senior guards, a man not given to much feeling, made a sound that might, in other circumstances, have been a laugh. "What makes you think," I said, "that you can do what she could not?" The healer considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know that I can," she said, "but I've sat with creatures that were dying when no one else would. A wolf that had been alone so long he'd forgotten how to let anyone near. A horse so badly hurt she was trying to die, and I had to persuade her out of it. The thing you can't send ahead of you is force. You can only go in, and be still, and wait to see what the creature needs." She paused again. I thought it was worth trying. I've been wrong before. I studied her for a long moment. I had spent 6 months being told by everyone around me what Varric was. A danger, a liability, a creature whose time had come, a beast to be put down before the dying became destruction. I had spent 6 months refusing. Not because I was sentimental, or not only that, but because Varric had been the bond of my bloodline for 300 years, and because something in me, the part that had grown up with the weight of his great shadow over the hold and the sound of his wings at dawn, could not accept that the answer was simply to let him burn out alone in a mountain cave. And here was a woman who had walked 3 days in winter on the strength of something a shepherd had told her about a name on a pass. "If he drives you back," I said, "you leave, immediately." "Of course," she said. "If he fires at you, I'll move," she said, with the tone of someone who had thought about this and did not find it a particularly complicated problem. I looked at Edric. Edric looked back at me with the expression of a man who had served 3 generations of Dragon Kings and was reserving judgment. "Bring her to the inner gate," I said. "I'll take her myself from there." The mountain chamber smelled of old fire and something underneath it, the deep mineral smell of very old stone, and beneath that, something that had once been alive and vital, and was now burning low. I had not been inside in 2 weeks. The heat was manageable in the outer passage, but thickened as we went deeper, and by the time we reached the inner arch, it was the heat of a fever, uncomfortable, close, the kind that makes you feel that something is very wrong. She walked beside me without faltering. She had her satchel. She had tied her hair back more firmly somewhere along the passage. She was looking at the walls. "The stone," she said. "What about it?" "It's warm in a way that's uneven," she said. "There, and there." She pointed. "And cool here." "I don't know," I said. She nodded, filing this away. We reached the arch. The chamber beyond it was vast, a natural cavern that my ancestors had shaped over generations, the ceiling high enough to be lost in shadow, the floor worn smooth by 3 centuries of a dragon's weight. In the center of it, curled around himself the way a fire curls when it's running out of fuel, lay Varric. He was still enormous. That hadn't changed. 50 feet from the tip of his snout to the end of his tail, the scales the dark red-black of charcoal, the great wings folded against his sides. In his prime, those wings had been something to see, a span that blocked the sun when he flew over the hold, which he sometimes did in the early morning, when the light was coming up and the world was quiet, and I sometimes thought he did it because he liked how the shadow looked on the snow. Now he was smaller than he should have been, in the way of very sick creatures, as if he were shrinking inward. His flanks moved, but shallowly. The fire on his breath came out in short, irregular bursts. Not the controlled exhale of a resting dragon, but something labored, something wrong. He had heard us. One great eye opened, the color of old bronze, of sunlight through smoke, and the temperature of the room spiked. I had felt that spike before. It was the spike that had preceded the war captain's broken ribs. Beside me, the healer was very still. She didn't step back. She didn't step forward. She simply stood and breathed and waited for the spike to settle. It didn't settle entirely, but it didn't escalate. Varric's eye remained open, fixed on her with the specific, pressing attention of a creature deciding whether she was a threat. "You can wait here," she said, very quietly, not looking at me. "But stay still. He will fire before you're halfway across," I said. "Maybe," she said, and she walked into the chamber. I have seen courage in my life. I have seen warriors walk into battles where the odds were very clear, and walk anyway, and I have never considered that a small thing. But there is a particular quality to the courage of someone who walks toward a sick and frightened creature, without armor, and without weapons, and without any weapon at all, except their own stillness, and I am not sure I had seen it before. She didn't walk fast. She didn't walk slow. She walked at the pace of someone who was going somewhere, and was not afraid to take the time to get there properly, and at every step she let the space of the chamber adjust to her presence, the way you let a room's silence adjust when you enter it and don't want to break something. Varric's eye tracked her. The temperature spiked again at 15 feet. At 10, at 7 feet she stopped. She sat down on the stone floor. This was so unexpected, so entirely different from anything the war captain or the sorcerer or my cousin had done, that for a moment I simply stared. Varric stared too, if a dragon can be said to stare. The great bronze eye blinked. The temperature dropped 2 degrees. She opened her satchel. She did not take anything out of it. She simply opened it and set it beside her on the floor and rested her hands on her knees and looked, not at Varric's eye, not the direct, challenging stare of a fighter or the fixed gaze of someone trying to project authority, but at his flanks, at the way his breathing moved him, at the uneven quality of the fire that leaked between his scales. "Your vents are blocked," she said, not loudly, conversationally, in the tone of someone noting something mildly unfortunate. "There's been a rock slide on the south face. I saw the debris pattern coming in. That's why the heat is building wrong. You're not breathing the way you should because you can't draw the air through properly." Varric had not moved, but something in him, the quality of his stillness, had changed. "That's not all of it," she said, "but it's part of it, and it must be miserable." A pause. "The rest. Can I look? At your left side, there, where the scaling is wrong." The great eye closed, opened. She waited. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a creature making a decision of significant consequence, Varric shifted. He didn't move toward her. He didn't move away. He turned his head, very slightly, so that the left side of his body was marginally more visible, and the eye on that side, the eye that had been closed against the stone, opened and fixed on her. She moved forward 3 feet and crouched beside his left flank. I realized I had stopped breathing. She looked for a long time, not touching, just looking, with the focused attention she'd given the fire and the walls of the passage, that clean professional attention that asked only, "What is this, and what does it need?" "Here," she said, to herself or to Varric or to both. She touched the stone beside his left shoulder very gently. "Can I see here? Just look." The temperature in the room was the lowest it had been in 6 months. I had the sudden, irrational sense that the chamber itself was waiting. Varric exhaled, a long, low breath of fire, controlled and deliberate. The most controlled thing I had seen him do in half a year, and he shifted his weight so that his left shoulder came forward, so that she could see it. Between 2 scales, where they overlapped at the joint of the great left wing, there was a wound, small, by the scale of the creature, but deep, and wrong, and infected with a darkness that was not natural to dragonfire. Something had gotten in there. Something had been festering for months, quietly poisoning him, while we sent warriors into the chamber to try to reach him with force, and firebond and expertise in dragonkind, and none of them had thought to simply sit on the floor and wait for him to show them where it hurt. She looked at me. "I need light," she said, "and clean water, if you have it, and someone to clear those vents today if possible. The south face, the debris on the right side first." I was already moving. I will not pretend I understood what she did over the next 4 hours. I understood parts of it, the cleaning of the wound, which required a patience and a steadiness of hand that I watched from the archway with something approaching awe. The way she spoke to Varric throughout, not commands, not pleas, just a quiet and continuous accounting of what she was doing and why, the same tone you might use with someone who is frightened and in pain and needs to know that the person working on them knows what they're doing. "This will hurt," she would say, and then it would, and Varric would flinch, a movement that shook the stone under my feet, and she would stop, and wait, and then ask again. Always asking, always waiting for the shift, the minute signal, that meant he was ready to go on. I had spent 30 years commanding things. I had commanded armies and courts and councils. I had commanded storms of politics that would have drowned lesser holds. I had never in my life seen someone command something by never commanding at all, and I stood in the archway of the mountain chamber and watched her do it, and felt something shift in my chest that I did not immediately have a name for. By the time she finished, the vents were clear. I had seen to that personally, had climbed the south face myself with 4 of the hold's grounds workers, which Edric had found undignified, and which I had found, for the first time in months, useful. The air in the chamber was different when we came back down, cleaner, moving properly. The sick fever heat replaced by something older and drier and correct. Varric was still. Not the stillness of something that had given up, but the stillness of something that had been in pain for a long time, and was feeling, for the first time, the absence of it. She was sitting beside his head. She had, at some point, taken off her traveling cloak and folded it on the stone, and she was sitting on it with her back against the curve of his jaw, just sitting there, the way you'd sit by a fire at the end of a long day, and she was talking to him in a low voice that I couldn't make out from the archway. His eye was closed. His breathing was even. I sat down in the archway and waited. She came out 2 hours later. The fire on Varric's breath, when I looked past her, was burning steadily, clean and gold, instead of the sick banked red it had been. "He'll need the wound checked again in 3 days," she said. "And the vents kept clear. There may be debris from the winter snowfalls. You'll want someone checking the south face regularly." She paused. "And if someone could leave food in the outer courtyard, not force it, just leave it and go. He'll eat when he's ready. He hasn't eaten because it hurt him to breathe fire enough to hunt. Now that it won't, he'll be hungry." I looked at her for a moment. "You knew all of this," I said, "before you walked in there." "I knew that most dying creatures aren't trying to die," she said. "They're trying to manage something they don't know how to tell anyone about." She was putting her cloak back on. "The rest I found out when I got there. My cousin," I said, "with fire bond in her blood. She felt the pain from the doorway and couldn't get past it," the healer said, not unkindly. "Fire bond makes you feel what the creature feels. That's a gift for a healthy dragon. For a sick one," she paused, "it's like trying to help someone in a burning room when you also catch fire." I looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have fire bond," I said. "No. You have no blood bond with dragonkind." "No. You walked into that chamber with a healer's satchel and sat on the floor." She looked at me with the winter sky eyes, and something in them was, very quietly, amused. "And clean water," she said. "You shouldn't forget the clean water. That mattered." I laughed. It came out of me before I could prevent it, and it was a real laugh, the kind that has weight to it, the kind I hadn't heard from myself in 6 months. Edric, who had appeared at some point in the outer passage behind me, made a sound that suggested he found this alarming. "What do I owe you?" I said. "Nothing," she said, with the air of someone who had thought about this on the 3-day walk and had settled it before she arrived. "A healer doesn't walk 3 days through winter for nothing. A healer walks where there's something she can help with," she said. "I'd heard there was a dying dragon." "There was." "I've helped, that's sufficient." She picked up her satchel. I said, without planning to, "Don't go." She paused. "Not tonight," I said, recovering. "The Ashfire Pass is not safe in the dark. And you've been working for 4 hours. Stay the night. In the morning, if you want to leave, I won't stop you." A pause. She looked at me with the thoughtful attention she'd given the chamber walls, and the fire in the hearth, and everything else she'd assessed since she arrived. "All right," she said. "1 night." She stayed 3 nights. The first was because I asked. The second was because Varric ate, early on the second morning, came out of the mountain chamber for the first time in 6 months, and accepted the food that had been left in the outer courtyard, and she was there to see the wound and assess his breathing in the new air, and it was clear she should stay another day. The third night she stayed because it snowed, and the pass would have been genuinely impassable, and Edric told her so with an air of complete innocence that I recognized as the expression of a man who had decided to be helpful. On the third evening, I found her in the great hall, sitting by the central fire, writing in a small book she had produced from her satchel. Her healer's record, I assumed, notes on the wound and the treatment and what to watch for. She looked up when I sat across from her. "The pass will be clear by morning," she said. Not accusing. "Just noting, it will," I agreed. She looked at me. The firelight was on her face. She had, over 3 days, gradually seemed more at ease in the hold, not comfortable in the way of a guest who expects comfort, but comfortable in the way of someone who has decided a place is adequate and has stopped assessing it for threats. She had spoken with 2 of the hold's other healers and one of the grounds workers who'd helped clear the south face vents, and from what I had heard secondhand, those conversations had been the most practical and specific the hold's staff had had in years. "You could stay," I said. She was quiet. "Varric will need the wound checked. The vents need monitoring through the rest of winter, and," I paused, "you are the first person in 6 months to walk into that chamber and come back out with him breathing better. I would rather you stayed than train someone else to do what you do, because I am not at all sure it can be trained." "You could hire a dragon healer," she said. "There are some in the South Territories." "I looked into that," I said. 6 months ago. The ones who are qualified are also the ones who charge commensurately and who want very specific contractual arrangements about risk liability." The corner of her mouth moved. "Understandable. And none of them," I said, sat down on the floor. She looked at the fire. I'm a border healer, she said. I don't have court credentials. I don't know protocol. I'll say the wrong thing to your counsel within a week. My counsel, I said, has been telling me for 6 months to let Varric die. I am not currently taking their judgment on most things. Another pause. What are you asking? She said, directly. The way she'd said everything, not circling it, not softening it, just the question. I had asked myself this, these last 3 days, and I had kept arriving at an answer that was larger than I knew how to say without frightening her. So I said the smaller version, the one that was also true. Stay through the winter, I said, through the worst of the pass. See Varric fully recovered. After that, I paused. After that, you tell me what you want. Whether that's to go, I'll provide escort and provisions and anything else you need. Whether it's to stay, another pause. Whether it's to stay, we talk about what that looks like. She was quiet for a long time. Through the winter, she said finally. Through the winter. She looked back at the fire. Then she looked at me, and something in her expression had settled, not into agreement entirely, but into the quality of decision, the way she'd looked when she'd decided to sit down on the floor. All right, she said. Through the winter. She was still there when the first thaw came. I did not ask her again. That had been the bargain, and I kept bargains, and I had learned in the keeping of this one that she did not respond well to being pressured, not because she was avoidant, but because she was the kind of person who needed to arrive at things in her own time and her own way, and any attempt to accelerate that only made the clock reset. What I did instead was show her the hold, not in the way of a formal tour. Edric had offered one, and she'd thanked him, and suggested maybe later, in the way of showing someone the things you've always wanted to explain to someone who would actually be interested. The ice formation on the north wall that had been there since before my grandfather's time, and that my court treated as a curiosity, and that I had always thought was something else, something deliberate, though I couldn't say why. The library, not the formal receiving library where the council met, but the older room at the back of the east wing, where the records went back further than most of the kingdom's formal history. The foundry where the grounds workers maintained the hold's equipment, which she visited twice unprompted, and where I was told she'd had an extremely productive conversation about forge heat and wound cauterization. Varric was improving. By the end of the first month, he was flying again. Short flights, carefully, the wound still healing, and the hold's staff, who had spent 6 months working around the fact of a dying dragon in the mountain chamber, began to relax, in a way I hadn't realized they'd been holding themselves against. People laughed more. The kitchen started making things they hadn't made in months, things that required the great ovens fully lit, which had been impossible when the mountain heat was unpredictable and everyone was afraid of triggering something. She noticed this. She noticed most things. The hold is happier, she said, one afternoon in the library, not looking up from the record she was reading. She had developed, somewhere in the second month, a habit of reading in the library in the late afternoon, and I had developed a corresponding habit of being in the library in the late afternoon, which I did not think she had failed to notice. It is, I said, because of Varric. Partly, I said. She looked up. The rest of it is because, I stopped. Found the word. There has been something absent from this hold for a long time, something I couldn't name, and it has been less absent these past months. She looked at me for a moment with the winter sky eyes. You should say what you mean, she said. Not unkindly, just directly, in the way she said things. I mean, I said, that this hold has not felt like a home in a very long time, and it does now. And that is not only Varric. I paused. It is you. A long silence. The thaw came 2 weeks ago, she said. Yes. You didn't say anything. No, I said. I told you through the winter. What happened after that was yours to decide. She was quiet. Outside the library window, the late afternoon light was the particular gold of early spring, the kind that comes back every year, and every year feels like something you'd forgotten could be that color. I don't know what staying looks like, she said. Permanently. I've never, she stopped. I've always been able to leave. I've always known I could go. That's been, she looked for the word. That's been important to me. It doesn't change, I said. The ability to leave doesn't change. If you stay, it's because you've chosen to, not because I've arranged the passes to be blocked. The corner of her mouth moved. Edric would do it. Edric would do it, I agreed. but I wouldn't ask him to. She looked out the window. The spring light was on her face, and she was very still, in the way she was still when she was thinking about something seriously. What would it look like? She said. If I stayed. What are you? She paused. What are you asking? I said, directly. The larger version that I had been keeping to the smaller version of for months. I am asking you to be my queen. The library was very quiet. That's a significant escalation from through the winter, she said. It is, I agreed. I don't know court protocol. I know. I'll say the wrong thing to your counsel. The counsel, I said, watched a woman they had never heard of, walk into a chamber they were afraid of, and fix something they had given up on. They are not, at present, in a strong position to object to her on grounds of credential. She looked at me. And Varric? She said. Varric, I said, has been leaving things at your door for 6 weeks. A piece of ironwood, a piece of quartz from the mountain face. Yesterday what I believe was a piece of the old gate chain that he must have retrieved from somewhere. He doesn't do that for people he wants to leave. She looked down at her hands. I walked into that chamber because I thought it was worth trying, she said. Not because I thought I could fix it. I know, I said. That's why it worked. Another long silence. I need you to understand, she said, that I'm not a court woman. I don't know how to be the queen of a dragon hold. I know how to sit on a stone floor and wait for something hurt to tell me what it needs. That's what I know. That, I said, is what this hold needs. It's what I needed. And it is a great deal more than I had any right to hope for when you walked in chains 3 months ago. She looked at me. You took the chains off immediately, she said. You didn't need them. No, she said. I didn't. And something in her face had shifted, not to the decision quality exactly, but to something that was moving toward it. Something that had been held back by the habit of being able to leave, and was now, carefully, testing what it might feel like to stay. Let me think, she said. Of course, I said. I went back to my reading. She went back to her record. The spring light moved across the library floor. From somewhere in the mountain chamber, distantly, there was the sound of Varric settling, the deep resonant rumble of a dragon at rest. Warm, unhurried, the sound of something that had been sick, and was now itself again. She heard it. I watched her hear it. She was smiling, very slightly, at the record in her hands. She told me the next morning, not in the library, not in the great hall, in the outer courtyard, where she had gone at dawn to leave food for Varric in the way she'd established, quietly, without ceremony, putting the portions out, and stepping back and letting him come to them in his own time. He came earlier than usual. He was still the largest thing in any space he occupied, still able to stop a courtyard simply by being in it. But he had his full wingspan again, and the fire on his breath was clean gold, and he moved with the specific, considered grace of a creature that had recovered something it had nearly lost. He came to the food, he ate, and then he turned, with the deliberateness of a creature making a statement, and he crossed the courtyard, and he lowered his head to her. Not the defensive crouch of a sick animal managing its pain, not the wary, assessing half-gesture I had seen on that first day. A bow. The full, formal bow of a dragon acknowledging a queen, head down to the stone, the great wings slightly spread, the posture that my family's records described, and that I had never seen in my lifetime, and had not expected to see in this courtyard on a spring morning. She stood very still. She put her hand on the top of his head, very gently, and she said something too quiet for me to hear. And then she looked up and found me standing at the courtyard entrance, where I had come to find her, and the morning light was on her face, and she looked, not like a court woman, no, she would never look like a court woman, but like someone who had arrived somewhere she had not expected to arrive, and had decided, on consideration, that it was where she was meant to be. Yes, she said, across the courtyard. I walked to her. Yes, she said again, when I was close enough that it was only for me, and Varric raised his head, and the spring light came over the top of the mountain, and made everything gold. I took her hand. She did not pull away. In the great hall behind us, Edric, who I would later learn had been watching from the gallery window, which he would deny with completely implausible conviction, turned to the head of the hold's kitchen staff and said, "We'll need the ceremony hall prepared, and someone should probably tell the council." And Varric, in the outer courtyard, settled his great wings and breathed a long, clean column of fire into the morning sky, not the desperate sick burning of the last 6 months, but the fire of a dragon who had recovered himself, who was home, who was whole, and the whole valley heard it, and knew. She became my queen in a ceremony that she attended in her own traveling cloak, because no one had thought to prepare anything else in the 4 days between her saying yes and the council declaring they needed to do this properly before the spring lords arrived. She said this was fine. Edric disagreed but did not say so, loudly, to her face, which I considered personal growth. She still sits on the floor when she goes to see Varric. He still leaves things outside her door, less frequently now, but he has never entirely stopped. Last week it was a piece of glacial ice that he must have carried from somewhere north of the pass, wrapped in one of the hold's old gate chains, and we are not entirely certain what he meant by it, but she seemed pleased. And that is generally how we measure these things. She was right that she said the wrong thing to the council within a week. She told them that their plan to redirect the river drainage for the lower hold's advantage was going to cause a flood problem in the valley settlements within 2 seasons, and that it was the kind of decision that looked efficient from a council table and looked very different from the ground. She said it the same way she said everything, directly, without softening it, and with the specific factual confidence of someone who has spent years learning how things work by being in the places where they work. She was right. We redirected the drainage differently. There was no flood. The council has not, since then, been in a particularly strong position to question her judgment on most things. Edric finds this satisfying. He does not say so. She is my queen, and she is not what any court expected. And Varric bows to her every morning in the outer courtyard. And the hold has not been this much itself in 30 years. And I think about that sometimes. About the fact that she walked 3 days through winter on the strength of a shepherd's mention of an old name for a pass. And what would have happened if she hadn't? I don't spend long on that thought. It is not a useful one. She is here. The dragon is well. The spring is warm this year. That is what I know.